Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Baekdal Plus podcast. This is episode 5, and this time we're going to talk about startups, specifically why media startups never really seem to make a difference and what we need to do if we want to change that. So let's get started.
You're gonna learn just how true what goes comes around, round, round. What goes comes around, round, round. What goes comes around, round, 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 round. What goes comes around, round, round. What goes comes around, round, round. What goes comes around, round, round, round.
Okay, so let's talk about startups. When it comes to media startups, there's an odd thing going on. On one hand, we constantly see new media startups being formed, but then on the other hand, none of these startups ever seem to make a difference. Now you might say that's not entirely true, because what about startups like Flipboard or Blendle? And yes, those startups are kind of interesting, but also they don't really define the market as a whole. When you look at how people just use media in general, you don't really see a form of media consumption that is defined by the startups. People, generally speaking, mostly just consume media the way they have always done. But wait a minute, you say, that's not true. What about Netflix and Facebook or Apple and Google News? Well, yes, they certainly have a very big power in the market. And when you look at just random news consumption, Facebook, for instance, is very, very big. But here's the problem with Facebook. People don't go to Facebook because they're consuming news. They go to Facebook because they're doing other things, and then they just happen to consume news during that process. So if we talk about news consumption, as in something that we want people to do, Facebook is a big player in the market, but it's not really defining news consumption. So the question is, what kind of startups do we see that defines this specific form of news consumption? What is it that people use when they just want news or another form of specific form of content? Well, the reality is that when people want something specific, they almost always go to those specific channels. The only exception is when we look at purely digital native consumption. For instance, you see how people turn to YouTube to find all the best creators that they want to follow. The same thing that they also do with Twitch. So you might say that YouTube and Twitch are very strong startups that has dramatically changed the world of content. And you would kind of be right. But again, it's kind of a different form of startups than the thing that we usually define as being a media startup. So what is the problem with media startups? Why aren't we all using these new startups, these new ideas, and these new things? Well, the fundamental problem with media startups is that they're all trying to solve the wrong problem. To put this into perspective, I want to tell you a story. Now, as some of you know, I started my career in the fashion industry. And the fashion industry is a lot like the media industry. In the fashion industry, you are basically always doing the same thing, but at the same time, you are constantly asked to do something new. So when you look at a fashion brand, every single type of clothes is basically the same basic shape as it has always been, but you expect the fashion companies to always come up with new styles, new designs, and new trends. That's kind of like the same thing that we see in the media industry. As a newspaper or a magazine, you are basically doing the same thing month after month after month, but you're also expected to always publish something new. So the fashion industry and the media industry are actually fairly similar. Another thing that makes the media industry and the fashion industry very similar is just how much output that you have to generate all the time. In the media industry, of course, you have to constantly produce new articles, but in the fashion industry, you're kind of doing the same thing. When I worked for a big fashion company, we had several brands, and each one of these brands produced between 1,100 to 1,600 styles per year. And these styles were then divided up into 6 to 10 different collections. Now, you're already familiar with this concept. You know how fashion collection comes in a spring collection, a summer collection, an autumn collection, and a winter collection. But then on top of that, you have extra collections like the pre-spring collection or the pre-autumn collection or express collections that might come out a specific month. For some of the larger fashion companies, you might also have weekly collections, and if you are selling a lot of clothes online, you might have specific online collections that are just constantly renewing so that when people come to your web shop, there is always something new to see. This is how fashion companies work. And what's important is that for each of these collections, you have to create a campaign so that you can sell them. So when I was working at a fashion company, part of the work that I did was to find ways to promote these collections through our digital channels. And I didn't do this just all by myself. We had some work that we did in-house, but then we also reached out to outside agencies to ask them if they could come up with some new ideas that we could do. And this is where my story starts. Because there's an interesting thing that happens in fashion when you ask an outside agency to come up with a new idea for you. And that is that at some point, every single one of these agencies will come up with the same idea. And that idea is to create a virtual dressing room. Now, when you first hear this, you might think this is a really great idea because a virtual dressing room is exactly what you would need if you're trying to sell clothes online, right? Well, yes and no. You see, in the fashion industry, one of the biggest obstacles that you have is that of return rates. If you are trying to sell clothes online, people will return between 20 and 50% of the clothes they buy. So return rates is a massive, massive problem. And people are generally screaming to fashion companies that they want a better way to try on their clothes before they buy something in a web shop. So that's where the virtual dressing room comes in, because the virtual dressing room is supposed to solve this problem. You can create some kind of technical system that will allow people to maybe use augmented reality to see a picture of themselves, and then you can take clothes from your collection and put it on top of them, and it will all look pretty fancy. So that's a great idea, right? Well, no. You see, virtual dressing room is an idea that just doesn't work. And the reason is that it doesn't solve the right problem. So why is that? Well, the problem is with the fit itself. In the real world, when you go into a physical shop and you want to buy something, the clothes that you try on is also the clothes you end up buying. In other words, you know that it fits because you had that exact piece of clothes on your actual body. Now, this is important because in the fashion industry, companies usually operate with a 1 centimeter production tolerance, meaning that if you had a neckline of a certain width on a t-shirt, it might be off by 1 centimeter from that specific dimension. This has a big impact on how something fits, because for some people that 1 centimeter might mean that they don't feel comfortable, whereas for other people it might feel just fine. And this is an important thing to realize when it comes to virtual dressing room. With a virtual dressing room, everything is, well, virtual. It's just a visual representation. You take a picture of people, and then you put some clothes on top of them. That doesn't actually tell you whether that clothes fits, because you lack that one element that makes all the difference. And that element is, how does the clothes feel? Does it feel nice to wear? Well, a virtual dressing room can't tell you that. It can only show you what it looks like, but it doesn't help you feel whether something fits the right way or not. So, a virtual dressing room doesn't actually solve any problems because it looks fancy, but you still have all the same questions as when you started out. You wanted to know if a new pair of jeans would actually fit you, but after using the virtual dressing room, you still have no idea. Another problem is with cost. In order for a fashion company to design and produce 1,600 styles per year, they have to seriously optimize their workflow. And they do this by turning 2D design drawings into very technical production sketches that they can send off to the factories. The problem with a virtual dressing room is that it can't use these. If you want, for instance, to use augmented reality to show people how a piece of clothes can look on someone, you need a 3D model of each piece of clothes, which is a very time-consuming thing to make. So Virtual dressing rooms are hideously expensive to operate because you now have to create a 3D model of every single piece of clothes. And that takes a very, very long time. It often takes much, much longer than it took to just create the design in the first place. Then we have the problem with the user model of how this whole thing works. You can't do augmented reality in a browser, so you need a separate app. But most people wouldn't download an app just to shop some clothes, and even if you did, there is a whole problem with permissions around getting access to people's cameras and the privacy around that. And generally speaking, when you take all of these elements and you combine them, the reality is that the number of people who would be willing to use a virtual dressing room are maybe 2% or 5% of your total audience, and that means that it's no longer cost effective. Finally, we also have a problem with how you sell clothes in general. Now, one thing that agencies who are suggesting virtual dressing rooms to fashion companies don't understand is that the best way to sell something is not really about showing people the product itself, but is instead about inspiring people. Don't get me wrong, the looks of a product is obviously very important, but what's more important is how people feel about it. So if I were to choose between spending my marketing budget on a virtual dressing room or to spend it on influencer marketing, I would spend it on influencer marketing because that would be far more effective. So again, a virtual dressing room just doesn't work. It solves the wrong problem. It is far too expensive. The user interaction model means that only maybe 5% of your audience will ever use it, and it's the wrong way to sell your products. So with all of these disadvantages, why do agencies keep suggesting that fashion companies should create virtual dressing rooms? I mean, last month alone, I saw 2 new startups suggesting this idea, and both of them thought they had come up with the best new thing they've ever seen. Well, the reality is that I have experienced this for the past 20 years. I worked in the fashion industry for 14 years, and I saw examples of virtual dressing rooms all the way back in the late 1990s. Of course, back then we didn't have augmented realities in our phones, but we did have virtual mirrors. Now, you might say, wait a minute, virtual mirrors, that's a new thing. It's just now that we have this. No. We had virtual mirrors in the late 1990s. Of course, they weren't just they're using rather large cameras and the quality was not very good, but this idea is not new and I've seen tons and tons of examples of it. And this is the problem with many startups. In every single industry, there is always some type of idea that keeps coming back again and again and again, even though it simply doesn't work. In the fashion industry, it's about virtual dressing rooms. In the car industry, it's about flying cars, and in other industries, there are similar ideas that just won't die. So, why did I tell you this story? Well, it's because we have exactly the same problem in the media industry. Media startups generally suffer from the same problem in that they keep coming up with the same ideas over and over again, and it never really works. And the reason why it doesn't work is because they're trying to solve the wrong problem. For media startups, this almost always relates to 2 things. It either relates to payment startups who are trying to solve a problem with how publishers are getting paid, which is something that's very important, but you have to solve it the right way. Or it's about curation startups who are basically trying to solve the problem of discovery. So let's talk about both, and let's start with payment startups. For the past 8 years of working as a media analyst, I've been contacted by payment startups almost at the rate of 1 every 2 months. That's nearly 50 startups over the past 8 years. And with a few exceptions, all of them have been trying to solve the problem of paying for news in exactly the same way, which is to do micropayments. So for the past 8 years, these startups have contacted me, pitched their models, and they all think they have come up with a completely new and unique idea that has never been done before. But as you can probably guess, if 50 companies all pitch the same idea, well, then it's not really a new thing. And the only real difference that I have noticed is that within the past 2 years, instead of just pitching the same micropayment idea over and over again, these payment startups have also now started talking about blockchain. So now it's micropayments using blockchain, which is, as a model, exactly the same as before, but just using a slightly different technology. But there's one thing that you might have noticed. Micropayments don't work. There's been tons of experiments with micropayments in the media industry, and generally speaking, it doesn't work. So why is this? Well, there are many reasons why micropayments don't work, but just like with the idea of a virtual dressing room, it relates to the problem of what they're trying to solve. When it comes to getting paid for content, there are three big obstacles in our way. The first one is creating something that is worth paying for. The second obstacle is getting people to make the decision that they actually want to pay for it. And the third obstacle is with the act of paying. The problem with micropayments is that they think the last obstacle is the biggest one, in that they think that the act of paying is the key reason why publishers don't get paid. But that's simply not the case. The biggest problem publishers face today when getting people to pay for content has nothing to do with the money at all. Instead, the problem is almost entirely with the content itself. We see this all the time when we look at traditional publishers. The problem is that publishers traditionally have defined their value around the package of a magazine or a newspaper, meaning that the magazine as a whole might have value, but each individual article often doesn't. And think about what that means in terms of value. If each individual article isn't worth paying for, asking people to pay per article is the worst idea that you can ever have. So micropayments solve the wrong problem. It's supposed to make payments simpler, and since each individual article isn't designed to be worth paying for by itself, you are essentially trying to get people to pay for the wrong product. Then we have the problem with the decision to pay. We know that one of the biggest obstacles in general is to get people to convert. So as a publisher, you want to limit the number of times you try to convert people. And if you can get people to only convert once per month, or once per year, or even better, only once ever because you're using auto-renewable subscriptions, that is a far more effective way to get people to pay you than if you were to ask people to convert every single day. But again, look what micropayments do. Their model is based on asking people to convert per article, meaning that you're asking people to make a decision to pay with every single article. And that just doesn't work. I mean, why would you ever want to do that? That has to be the worst type of obstacle that you can put in your way in order to get people to convert. Can you imagine if you went to Spotify and instead of just paying once per month, you were instead asked to pay 10 cents per song? That wouldn't work, right? That would be insane. And if Spotify had ever tried to do that, they would no longer be in business. So the idea of asking people to pay per article is fundamentally flawed. It just doesn't work. So micropayments suffer from the same problem as a virtual dressing room. It's an idea that sounds convincing, and because of that, it's something that people keep talking about, but it's also fundamentally something that doesn't work because it's completely missing the point about what the real problem is. And what's also important to know is that it's not a technical limitation. You can't fix this by just adding more technology. It's a human decision problem. So when new startups come out today and tell you that they have come up with this new idea for micropayment, which is now also based on blockchain, they are still just completely missing what the real problem is. They haven't solved anything, and they are still just trying to do the same thing as every other startup have tried over the past 8 years. And again, it just doesn't work. This leads us to the second type of media startups, which is about curation startups. Like with payment startups, I am constantly approached by founders who think they have come up with the latest and greatest idea for some kind of curation startup, but they haven't. Instead, the idea that they have is exactly the same idea that I've heard repeatedly, probably more than 100 times before. The overall idea that they all have is very simple. First, they will take content from all the different publishers, put it on their own site in some type of way. Then they will add some type of fancy algorithm, which they all say is going to be better than Facebook, but which none of them have ever figured out how to make. And then they want to present this to people in some type of ranked or personalized feed that you can see. This is what they all suggest. Take content from somewhere, do some kind of magic that they don't really know what is, and then give you some kind of feed. And again, this model just doesn't work because of a long list of reasons. The most fundamental problem is that these startups haven't defined what problem that they are trying to actually solve. They're just trying to create yet another place for people to find more content. And when I tell them this, of course, they all disagree with me. They say, no, we want to help people find better content. We want to help people reduce the noise that they see online. Okay, fine, but pretty much all startups who have contacted me over the years don't actually do that. They say they want to create a better focus, but there's nothing in their model that would actually accomplish that, other than they are dreaming about it. Now, don't get me wrong. We all want something better. But unless they have found a way to actually accomplish that, they don't have a product yet. They don't have anything new or special to offer that we haven't seen 100 times before. Think about a new startup like Site, who defined themselves as the intelligent magazine that presented readers with news articles based on their personal interest. And this startup was later bought by CNN as being the next big thing for news consumption. Where is that startup today? Right. It's gone. It doesn't exist anymore. And the reason is that it tried to do the same thing that every other startup is trying as well. They just wanted to create a platform, but they didn't really think about what that platform should be about. And this is the mistake that they all make, in that they think the solution is to create a platform. But that's not what people need. They're solving the wrong problem. The second problem I have with all these startups is that they talk about their market in the abstract. What I mean is that we have three elements when it comes to content online. We have the creators, the content itself, and the readers. But you will notice that the business model that these startups have don't really focus on any of these. The readers are just, anyone. The content is just, whatever. And the creators aren't anyone in particular. In other words, they haven't defined a market. The problem is that this model doesn't actually work anymore. I mean, sure, we got Facebook, and Facebook is based on this, but think about how Facebook works. For creators, Facebook has proven to be mostly an unusable platform. It's not a place where you can make enough money to just make it work. And for the readers, it becomes a low-intent micro moment where you don't really care about any of the content. And despite the fact that Facebook became this massive platform, it doesn't actually work for anyone else. And more to the point, you can't copy their model and create something similar. So any startup today that is defined around just being yet another platform without having any clear definition of either their audience, the content, or the creators is likely to fail. We don't need yet another Facebook. We need something different that actually works. But most startups, even today, still think this is the model to copy, so they get nowhere. The third problem is that of monetization. The idea that most startups have in that they will just take content that other people have made and then use that without any form of compensation is a model that's been tried and failed consistently for the past 15 years. So when startups say that it will take content from publishers and then only pay for it via link traffic, they are creating a model that only works for them, but it doesn't work for anyone else. For many years, publishers hoped that this would work, which is why they invested in being on all of these other channels. But today, we know that it doesn't work. We know that link traffic by itself does not justify the cost of having your content on other channels. As a result, publishers and content creators in general are now demanding to get paid if they are going to allow a startup to use their content. This is not just demands that are coming from the traditional world of media, it's the same with YouTubers. The reason why popular YouTubers aren't too hot on using Snapchat, Facebook, or Instagram is simply because they can't make any money from it. So popular YouTubers don't consider those channels as being relevant to them. As a result, what we see today is that most new services are starting to talk about monetization from the very start. When Facebook launched Facebook Watch, it was based on the promise that monetization would be possible, and it was the same with Instagram TV. So monetization has become this critical factor for any startup who wants to become relevant as an app for future media use. And if you haven't figured out how to monetize and pay for the creators in a way that makes financial sense, then you simply don't have a media startup yet. Monetization now has to be figured out from the very start. But none of the media startups have realized this yet. They continue to just think that free content is the future, and it just isn't. Free content, as in the content you pay for via links, doesn't work. And if that is the basis for your startup, then your startup doesn't work. So these are all the problems that we see with the media startups today. It's like how we in the fashion industry keep seeing these virtual dressing rooms that fails to understand what the real problem is. In the media industry, we keep seeing these media startups that also don't focus on the real problem. And the result of this is that we keep hearing about these new startups, but we never see any real change. When I look back at all the startups who have contacted me over the past 8 years, something like 99% of them no longer exist or in some other ways have failed to make any kind of difference. There are a few exceptions. There are some that I might think have an interesting model because they have actually defined something more specific. And there are a few who are kind of on a trajectory to something bigger. But generally speaking, everyone else have failed because either they didn't define their market or their audience or the content. They just tried to be another random platform. They forgot about monetization, or rather they thought that monetization was not something they had to do up front. They could just wait 5 years and then do it, but that doesn't work anymore. Or it was simply because that their entire model was focused on solving a problem that people don't have. Or rather, they tried to solve a problem that sounded like something people had, but it wasn't actually the right problem to begin with. Okay, so what should a media startup do? Well, first of all, in order for a media startup to work and to be relevant, you have to define not just yourself as a platform, but define yourself as something far more specific. And that means you have to define yourself around a specific moment, a specific form of intent, a use case, and a specific problem that you're trying to find a solution to. If you don't have a very, very clear idea about what those are, you don't have a startup yet. You haven't done any of the work that you need to do. What you have is just the same thing as every other startup is saying, is that, well, we have an idea, but we don't know how to do it yet. Well, guess what? Nobody knows how to do it yet. Your job is to figure out how to actually make it work. And until you get to that point, you don't have a startup. So the first step is to think about the moment. We have micro moments when we are just doing something quickly, and we have macro moments from when we are deciding to do something more profound. A key way to think about moments is also about what decision that people make. Is it a moment that is defined around a decision to do something, or is it a moment that people just do because, well, they're bored? And the difference in how people consume content and what type of content that they consume within these types of moments is massive. So as a startup, if you just try to create a little bit of everything and you haven't defined a moment, you are creating content for people who don't know what they want, but the moment doesn't fit what they're actually trying to do. So take something like a macro moment. A macro moment is when you have a more profound moment. It's something that you have decided to take some time off to. And here, of course, we have two different kinds of scenarios. We have a macro moment when you're trying to accomplish something. In other words, you have a goal that you want to reach, or you have a problem that you want to solve. That type of moment is not solved by creating just a random feed of content. That type of moment is solved by creating a service, something far more specific that helps people achieve just that result. On the other hand, we have the more relaxed type of macro moment. This, for instance, is what is happening when you're watching Netflix. You would just sit down and you would open up your favorite TV show, whatever that is, and then you'll just start watching it, and you don't really have any other plans. That is a macro moment defined around relaxation. But again, here, think about what's happening. A macro moment is something where, again, I have decided to do something. So just giving me random content doesn't work. Instead, it's all about creating something that is very, very enjoyable for people to relax with without asking them to do something. So it's very, very different from the other type of macro moment, but it's not a random moment. It's a specific moment. We see the same thing with micro moments. Micro moments are very, very fast moments where people haven't really dedicated the time to do anything. And in those types of moments, the model that you create depends on what that micro moment is. If people are just looking for a quick answer to something, the micro moment is all about speed and efficiency. Whereas if you are standing in line in the supermarket, the micro moment is quick and fast, but it's not specific. And this is the problem that I see with most of these startups, because most of these startups talk about creating something that is valuable and will help you get out of the noise of the internet. But then by focusing on something completely random, what you actually end up doing is you're creating a low-intent micro moment. You're essentially creating a moment for people standing in line in the supermarket, but as soon as you go anywhere else, this startup or this platform just doesn't really work anymore. I'm reminded here by an article I noticed earlier this week. It was in one of the big newspapers, I can't remember which one, but the article was about how to do podcasting better. So think about what type of moment that is. If you want to tell people how to do podcasting better, what is it that people actually want? Do they want a quick article that you can read while standing in line in a supermarket? Or do they want a macro moment where they can really dig down into it and really start to learn about how to do this thing very well? Well, the answer in this case, of course, is that it's the latter. When you write an article about how to do podcasting better, you are creating a learning moment, or in other words, a macro moment. But the article that I saw in this newspaper was a micro moment. It was something like 600 words long. It was kind of a listicle, and it didn't really tell you anything very specific. It just very quickly told you, well, you need a good microphone, and you need some time, and you need some other things. I can't remember. So basically, the concept of the article was not to give you value, but to just have you spend a brief moment of time on their site. It completely failed. And this is what I see with most of these startups as well. You are not creating the right moment. You're creating something that isn't really worth spending any time on. And when you try to do that, you don't actually get any better than what we already have. I mean, if I just wanted to waste my time, I could just go to Facebook and click on some random links. But if I'm going to spend my time in a separate app that is focusing only on content or news, that content has to be different than what I find on Facebook. And that's the key. You have to create a different moment than what Facebook provides and what the internet provides in general. Finally, as I talked about before, we have the concept of monetization. If you are creating a startup today, you have to build monetization into your system from day one. But more importantly, you have to think about what relationship you're actually creating with your value. The purpose of a media startup is to do one simple thing. You are here to create a connection between those who create and those who consume. In other words, publishers on one side and readers on the other side. And the value that you create is to find a way to make that connection valuable to both of these people. The failure that we see in the market today is that it's often based on only one of those sides having any form of value. So for instance, we see a lot of startups who tries to value the experience for the reader, but the creator don't actually get anything out of it. That doesn't really work. So you have to find a way to create value. And in this case, I mean actual money and revenue and profits in a way so that people would want to pay your startup so that you can pay the creators. And this exchange of value must be so high that the creators can actually make a living from it. One example of this is what we see on YouTube and on Twitch or on Patreon. Now, granted, YouTube is not nearly as good as it once was. The revenue that you can earn from YouTube is kind of getting a bit problematic from most creators. But when you look at the concept of YouTube, and you also look at the concept of things like Twitch or Patreon, what you see is that they have created platforms where connecting creators and readers together in a way so that they can make money from it is essential to what is a media platform today. So as a startup, your job is not just to create another feed of content, because we already have that and nobody needs another feed. Your job is to find a different way to approach content so that you can monetize creators. And once you do this, the creators will want to do something that is actually useful and valuable to people, instead of just posting, listicles and other crap because they can't really afford to do anything else. So this is the new world we are moving into. Now, if you don't believe me, and if you think that I am just talking nonsense and that the future is still free content, I will invite you again to just think about Facebook Watch or Instagram TV. Notice the trend that you're seeing with those apps. Both of these apps came out telling people that we would want to create a platform where monetization was going to be a key element of what they're going to do. Now, mind you, because it's Facebook, they're still focusing on the wrong type of moment, because Facebook only knows how to create micro moments. But the concept of Instagram TV, for instance, was to create a platform where you could have a more valuable moment and where that moment would pay creators, so the creators in turn would be interested in creating more valuable content. Now, personally, I don't think Instagram TV would actually succeed, but that has more to do with Facebook and the mindset of what has created Facebook. But as a media startup, that is the way you need to think. You need to think of a way to create that form of value and to define that value in a specific term around a moment, around intent, and around all these different things. So instead of just creating another platform that nobody wants, you create something specific. You solve something that people want you to solve. So that's the next step. What would you do if creating just another feed wasn't the solution? How would you make that work? And of course, this isn't just about startups. This is about publishers as well. The reality today is that we are all startups. And the key to the future is to forget about the model that created Facebook and Twitter, because those platforms were created in a time when people used the internet in a different way. Today, we need something more than Facebook. And with this, we come to the end of this episode. Now, if you're interested in learning more about new startups, I actually wrote a Plus report about this about a year ago in an article called "We Need to Drastically Rethink the New Startups." Now, that article has kind of a similar focus as this episode, but I'm also covering some other things. So if you want to learn more about this, just look up that article. Also, don't forget the other articles I published earlier this week. My latest Plus report is about how we can save local newspapers by getting rid of the newspaper package itself. And if you are an editor or a journalist working for a local newspaper, I highly recommend that you read that. I also recently wrote an article about how we should think about fixing the way we cover elections, which is very, very relevant right now because the US midterm election is only about 3 months away as I'm publishing this. So have a look at that if you're interested. And as I've said many times before, remember to tell your friends about this podcast. This is still the early days of this podcast, and we are only up to episode 5. And the more people who can discover it and learn about it, the better it can be. And I can also start to learn more about what it is that you actually want from this. So tell your friends, and if you have any feedback or suggestions, you're always welcome to contact me over at Twitter, or even better, send me an email. But as always, thank you for listening.
Did you pack the flashlight, the blanket, and the map? It's a real adventure, the trail you're looking at. I'm glad you came. For a while I thought you might be bailing. Is that the same yellow shirt you used to wear? But 1,000 years seem like almost no time now. This guitar right here, do you still remember how? I played for you, I was crappy, but you sang along, and I thought you knew I could die to keep you near. We've got a fire in the tent, it's 5:30 a.m. useless words. What you said, what I said, that might have made it worse. We're here again at the same spot where we kissed the first time. I swear my pain's far away, long gone by now. We've got a fire in the tent. It's 5:30 a.m. Let's be the kids who left, get in trouble again. Let's talk, got nothing on you. That was brand new, still it's got nothing on you tonight. We could get back to this, catching up what we missed, or we could just relive that summer night. For all I can, we could spend the firewood till it's end. Nobody's gonna force the morning. We've got a fire in the tent. It's 5:30 a.m. Let's be the kids who left, get in trouble again. That star's got nothing on you. That one's brand new, still it's got nothing on you tonight. We've got a fire.